My name is James Fallows. I'm here in several roles. I'm a member of the board of the New America Foundation. I'm a friend and a sometime contributor to Slate, who's one of the co-sponsors with New America of this wonderful panel this morning. I'm a writer for the Atlantic Monthly magazine. And I'm happy to welcome you to what I think will be an extremely interesting discussion on a breaking news topic with large implications about China's firewall. Can it hold? What that means for China, for the technology world, for the world in general. I have a couple of housekeeping announcements before we start off the discussion. One is to say this is a partnership presentation between New America and Slate magazine. David Plotz, the editor of Slate, is with us, and so I recognize him. There'll be a more formal announcement of this partnership in the future, but this is sort of a soft launch of these collaborative efforts. I should also say, on a housekeeping matter, if you have cell phones, please turn them off or silence them. That would be a courtesy to everybody. Please be aware that the discussion we're about to have is on the record, and it's being both recorded for the web, and it will be broadcast around the world, including in China. We know we have a number of friends who are watching in China now, so we say send a big howdy to them as long as they're in the loop. And if it's possible for them to send in some questions later on, we'll try to arrange that as well. The topic that we have this morning could not be more timely or more important. It has immediate breaking news type significance in the news of the last week about Google's startling announcement. I think we may hear differently from some of our other China hams in the panel, but to me this was the most surprising news about China's relationship with the outside world that I've heard in many years, and the most interesting in the ramifications and ripples it sets up. It's timely in the sense that Secretary Clinton tomorrow Secretary of State Clinton is giving a speech about the larger question of internet freedom, what the American national policy is on this, and the vision for that. We have one of the architects of that speech who will be our lead-off speaker this morning. We know there are strategic issues at stake here in China's role in the world and how China is developing internally and interacting with other countries, and we have questions about the future path of the internet. And these are things we'll explore with members of our panel. I'm going to just name the four members of our panel now. I'll say a bit more about each of them before he or she speaks. We're going to hear first from Alec Ross, who's the Senior Advisor for Innovation to Secretary of State Clinton. He's going to speak first, and then I'm just going to exchange a question or two with him before he leaves, because there is news that he's involved in. He'll have to leave before the end of the panel to go work further on the speech, but he will first speak. Then Rebecca McKinnon, who's now a fellow of the Open Society Institute, will speak. Then Evgeny Morozov, who's a contributing editor of Foreign Policy magazine and the Yahoo Fellow from Georgetown University, and then Timothy Wu of the New America Foundation and Columbia Law School. So first we're going to have Alec Ross tell us what he can about the U.S. government vision, his own vision of the role of the internet in dealing with China and in the relationship between the internet and the kinds of values that the United States would like to promote around the world. Alec Ross.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I'm going to speak very briefly, in part because what I want to do is give some context to Secretary Clinton's remarks tomorrow morning. I have to say it's a real treat to be here, in part because 10 years ago I and three friends started a nonprofit called One Economy. There were four of us, and we worked out of a basement. And it happened to be the basement of this building. And this is a very nice office. The basement is not. So it's a treat for me to be here today, and boy, a lot's changed in 10 years, suffice to say. What I wanted to do was give again some context to Secretary Clinton's remarks tomorrow. By way of background, 2009 was a very good year for Secretary Clinton in terms of how she systematically integrated technology into America's diplomatic agenda. From the moment she became Secretary of State, she asked herself, in a world with increasingly borderless threats, where the promise and the peril of the 21st century are no longer bound by vast distances or natural boundaries, and where technology is at the core of frictionless communications, boundaryless engagement, how can we maximize its effective use in service of our diplomatic goals? And so one of the things that we did under the rubric of 21st century statecraft, which she has pioneered, is we've established projects all over the globe, from Rwanda to the Congo to Mexico, to Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, thinking about how technology can be used as an instrument in our foreign policy, not just for conventional things like public diplomacy, though we did use it to good effect, for example, to help make President Obama's Cairo speech viral on digital networks so that we were not bound by the strictures of state-controlled broadcast media. But it's been used as an instrument to begin the fight against drug cartels in Mexico. It's being used to combat sexual and gender-based violence in the Congo. We are making mistakes of commission rather than omission in terms of our experimentation, integrating the tools of the digital age into our statecraft. And one of the things that Secretary Clinton recognized, in addition to the opportunity to integrate these tools into our statecraft, was the opportunity to update our policy framework. And one of the things that she has monitored and has immersed herself in since she became Secretary of State is this issue of Internet freedom. And Internet freedom, even though it's just very, very recently become a sexy A1 above the fold topic for popular consumption, it's something that's been of concern and of a great deal of focus for those of us in the Obama administration since we entered it. And it's because it really exists at the convergence of economic issues, human rights issues, and security issues. I would argue that it is not any one of those three exclusively. It really is this space where economics, human rights, and security come together. And in thinking about how we wanted to update our policy framework, what Secretary Clinton has said is that, look, we have long-standing values that are not years and decades old, but centuries old. Values related to the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of press. And what we saw over the course of 2009 were real challenges to each of these long-standing values, each of these freedoms in digital spaces. And point in fact, it's about 31% of the world right now that live in countries with internet censorship. So her policy address tomorrow is going to speak to internet freedom and lay out a policy framework and a series of initiatives and in State Department parlance, deliverables for what we're actually going to do along these lines to help ensure that these centuries-old values are protected and preserved in the 21st century. Another aspect that she pays particular close attention to, and which she includes within the framework of internet freedom, is making sure that we fully account for technology's potential from an economic and from an educational and economic development perspective. It will come as news to none of you that one of the things that she's focused on most closely since becoming Secretary of State is economic empowerment, with a particular focus on women in the developing world. And so a big thrust of hers and of the department's in 2010 is going to be to push out not just the use of these technologies, but the adaption of these technologies for economic empowerment purposes. When I came to the State Department in April of last year as the Secretary's senior advisor for innovation, there were an estimated 4.1 billion mobile handsets on the planet. Today, 9-10 months later, there are 4.6 billion mobile handsets on the planet. So just think about that. 9 months, we go from 4.1 to 4.6 billion mobile handsets on the planet. So it's a more than 10% increase. And what that means is we're past the tipping point of global connectedness, especially since about 75% of those 500 million plus handsets are in place in the developing world. And so in addition to addressing issues regarding internet censorship and looking at what needs to be done defensively, so too I think can we anticipate a lot that the State Department will be doing offensively to make positive use of these tools, particularly for economic empowerment. And I'll close by saying that we don't just view the issue of internet freedom as something that relates to freedom of expression and doesn't just relate to sort of the modernization and accounting for freedom within a networked world, but it also goes to the issue of what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where there is one internet and where there is one knowledge commons from which we can all draw? Or do we want to live in a world where the information you have access to, the knowledge that you have access to, is based on what country you live in and the whim of the censors in those countries? So I'll close with that, and Jim, I've got time for one, maximum two questions.
Okay, I'll make them terse so I can ask two of them. One of them is, can you describe the thinking that goes into, in the moment of where there's a very highly publicized standoff between an American-based company and a foreign government, what is the thinking about the role the U.S. government should or should not play in addressing that dispute?
Yep. So that's a very good question. I think it is important to emphasize the private nature of some of this. This is principally, this is primarily an issue between Google and 30+ other private entities in the Chinese government. But we have responded with what I think is justifiable concern. We've asked for an explanation. We have had conversations over the years where we have made clear our opinions both about the freedom of expression as well as cybersecurity. So we're taking this very seriously. But all of that said, the State Department is not the foreign policy arm of Google. So while we will look to the Chinese for an explanation, we do need to engage in this appropriately, recognizing the primacy of the role of the private sector actors within this.
Right. The other question is, and thank you for that, you mentioned there are century-old values in the United States, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Those are two particular freedoms that another major government in the world explicitly denies. The Chinese government policy does not believe, particularly in freedom of assembly or freedom of speech. In what way does the Secretary address that conflict between our values and the values of another major nation? How you deal with this? Yeah,
so I'm not going to, I will answer that, but principally by saying tune in tomorrow at 9:30.
Good answer.
Listen, ever since, a previous Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, said, the only foundation for legitimate government is the will of its people, and to protect its free expression should be its first order. Ever since Thomas Jefferson said that in the 18th century, there's been a difference between our own values-based framework and those of other countries around the world. And, that hasn't changed and that will not change. But just as we didn't mute our assertion of those values in the 18th century, I don't think we should today. I think that we can account for cultural differences. I think we can account for different value frameworks, but I don't think that should allow us to mute our own. People are oftentimes talking about this specifically within the context of China, but it's not relevant only to China. And tomorrow's speech is not a speech about China. There are now, and I put this in quotation marks, honor killings of women in the Middle East when they use social media. There are manipulations of content and extreme censorship in countries like Tunisia. And so even though China is very much is grabbing the headlines today, I think that one of the things that we need to recognize is the global perspective of this. And going to your point about the relativism of our values, yes, there is some relativism between the values of the United States and China, but so too with much of the Arab world and much of Africa, and I don't think we're going to mute our assertion of those values within any of those contexts. So I apologize for having to go now, but it's been a real treat.
Well, thank you, and promising we'll all be listening tomorrow. Let's please thank Alec Ross for being here and for the work he's doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's turn now to Rebecca McKinnon, who probably of all the members of this panel and probably of most of the people in the world has spent more time witnessing the Chinese evolution of the internet and the implications, political, cultural, and sociological. And I wonder, Rebecca, if you would tell us what you think is underappreciated, misunderstood, mischaracterized in the prevailing Western reaction to the Google news of the last week and the Chinese firewall situation in general. Most people who are listening to you now will not have had the experience you've had in seeing how the Chinese internet population has developed. And so what are we missing? What are most people missing in the understanding of this recent news?
Thanks. Thank you for the very generous introduction. And just one explanation for why I have my cell phone up here. It's not because I'm completely rude. It's because there are people in China who are watching this live and who may be contributing some questions and comments through Twitter, and I'm able to see those questions and comments if I have my phone here and can look at that Twitter stream. So that's what I'm doing. I'm not texting my boyfriend or something like that. And actually, there was already one person in China, one Chinese person on Twitter just posted the request that the speech tomorrow be streamed on a website that people in China can actually access and that isn't blocked. So we'll see if the State Department addresses that technical issue. But to get to Jim's questions, there were two parts there. One has to do with the misconceptions or certain things that are less understood about Chinese censorship, and the other question had to do with perhaps what people might be missing about the general dispute with Google. To start with the Chinese censorship issue, I think one of the things that perhaps is not so well understood has to do with the nature of Chinese internet censorship. Many of you have heard the term the Great Firewall of China, which is the term that people tend to use to refer to China's system of blocking websites. And technically, that technical process is known as filtering. And what that means is when you're on an internet connection inside China and you try and access my blog or Human Rights Watch or any number of the hundreds of thousands of websites that the Chinese internet service providers are required to block, when you type that address in, you get an error message on your browser. It says this site cannot be found. And that's the system of blocking of overseas websites. But that's only one layer of Chinese internet censorship. And oftentimes in the reporting about Chinese censorship, it kind of makes it seem like that's the only aspect of Chinese internet censorship. And actually, most Chinese language content that's relevant and used by people inside China is, of course, in Chinese. It's hosted by Chinese companies operating on computer servers inside China, right? And so these are all companies that, as you know, I think websites don't kind of just float around in outer space. Their data is actually physically hosted on computers somewhere. And so Chinese-operated websites are all on computers inside China, which means they're inside PRC jurisdiction, which means that the Chinese government doesn't need to just merely block their content. It can require that any offensive content be taken off the internet completely. So most domestic Chinese websites are held liable by the Chinese government for everything their users do on their services, for everything that gets posted, and they're held responsible for removing offensive content, both politically offensive or sexually offensive or whatever. And if they don't do a good enough job of removing content, they lose their business license. And in American sort of legalese, that's called intermediary liability. In other words, the companies are held heavily liable for what users do on the carriers and platforms. And so what that means is actually that within the Chinese domestic web, censorship is outsourced to the private sector. And so the private sector is actually censoring itself. The censorship is not primarily being done by internet police and by government officials. It's only the censorship of the part of the web that the Chinese government cannot directly control that is being blocked. And anything that the Chinese government can physically control is being deleted. And so what that means is that We talk a lot about circumvention technology, which is the technical term for proxy servers or VPNs or other technologies that we use when we are in China to access Twitter and to access Facebook and to access Human Rights Watch and my blog and whatever else. And that's great, and that's very useful in helping you get around censorship for websites that are outside of China. But it's useless in accessing content that's been deleted from the internet. So circumvention, which is something that actually is being supported financially by the State Department and by many NGOs, only solves the problem of helping people access the web that's outside of China. The web that is being built inside of China for Chinese people by Chinese people is heavily culled, and circumvention does nothing to solve that problem. So that's one point to make that I think a lot of people don't realize, and that's kind of the system that Google.cn was subject to because they were operating inside China. They were held liable for the results that would appear when their users searched for certain terms, and held responsible for keeping results that the government found offensive, unacceptable, etc., off of their page. And if they did not do an adequate job, then they are pressed by regulators to clean up their act. And in Chinese, in China, this is not known as intermediary liability. It's known as self-discipline. And actually, Baidu, Google's main competitor in China, Robin Li, their CEO, was given a self-discipline award back in November. And I was actually, along with 19 other CEOs of Chinese internet companies, and I was actually at the ceremony and I witnessed this. It was quite bizarre. But that's how it works in China. The Chinese companies are under tremendous pressure to behave and to really be nannies for the Chinese public. So that's a point about Chinese internet that I think is not well understood here in the West and not well reported. I think the other point, the larger point about Google and China is that I think, particularly amongst China watchers and people in China, it's perceived as being all about China and all about the U.S.-China relationship. Whereas I get the feeling from what I know about Google and just from what I know about global internet trends and the fact that censorship is spreading worldwide, intermediary liability is becoming increasingly popular in Western democracies, that these are censorship and threats to the open web, the open internet, are growing globally. This is not just a China problem. And I think Google is making a stand about the global internet, and this is really about the future of the global internet and how it's governed around the world. And I think concern that if they do not take a more aggressive stance in favor of a free and open internet in China, that this is going to be very bad for their business globally, and that Google's business really depends on its entire business model, its planning for the future, is banking on an open and free internet, and their business will not succeed if the internet becomes overly balkanized, because that's the value that it's providing to its users, is this globally interconnected network. And governments around the world, including France and Italy and others, not just, I mean, China's a class of its own, but the threats to the open and free internet are many, and I think that this is a stand in a particular direction. While clearly the Google executives have talked a lot about, this is the right thing to do, this is the ethical thing to do, and it's part of not being evil, and so on. And of course, there's the whole issue of the hacking, which Evgeny, I'm sure, can talk a lot more about. I think the other point is that this happens to be a case where doing the right thing and doing the thing that is in Google's greatest self-interest for its business long-term happen to converge.
Thanks. And just one quick follow-up before we have the general discussion. These are very rich points. When you said that Google was making a stand about internet freedom in general and just happened to be about China, my observation of their actual statement, it was generalized in saying there are other companies than Google, but it didn't say there are other countries than China. Do you think what are the public indications that Google is broadening this beyond China?
Well, I mean, if you look at, I mean, in that particular statement was just about China. But if you look at the blog on which that statement was posted, the Google policy blog, and you go through the postings for the last couple months, you see statements expressing concern about censorship in Australia. You see a post about a workshop that Google hosted in December in which they brought in the leading hacktivists from the University of Toronto and elsewhere to talk about the growth of internet censorship globally and about what Google might be able to do to help the cause. And there's a post from another Google executive about the importance of the free and open internet for Google's business. You have items about ACTA, this secret trade agreement that the Obama administration is negotiating with how many of 34 other countries or something. Tim can talk about that. Which may well increase intermediary liability of carriers around the world, which we can't access because the Obama administration says it's a trade secret, which Google is very much not in favor of, and have been hosting events on. So if you look at what they've been saying lately and what they've been doing and their policy positions, the fact that David Drummond, who wrote that post, is on trial on criminal charges in Italy for so there are a lot of issues that you go through. And you'll see they're taking a stand. They did not link that particular post, that particular statement, to global issues. And, I think it would have been conflating things and confusing things to do so in that case. But it's within the context, I think, of very clearly a global strategy.
Great, thank you. Did you want to address that directly?
Add to that. I mean, I can't speak for Google, but Rebecca's right. They've had well-known disputes with the Turkish government, with the Thai government. And in a different sense, you can understand the entire net neutrality debate in the United States as the effort to stop censorship domestically. So the thing we talk net neutrality in the headlines now and then, the FCC moving forward on a rule for net neutrality, is an effort by Google, other companies, and other internet freedom advocates to have the same internet freedom rules in domestic context.
Great, thank you. I want now to turn to Evgeny Morozov, who's written often about tech policy, about internet evolution for the Foreign Policy blog. And I'm going to start, before asking you, as Rebecca did, about the implications of hacking in this case, by mentioning one of your recent posts with which I disagreed. So I'll make the contrary case and then hear the contrary argument. You were saying in one of the early posts reacting to Google's announcement that Google had finally come to its senses, that it had been doing something, it had made a pact with the devil all along, and so now it was coming back towards the sunlight. The contrary case, that if you set aside the intrusions and the hacking, that this was not a pact with the devil, I would report, based on the years I was living in China, where more information was available to Chinese people because Google.cn was trying to be there than not. And as Rebecca was arguing, the competitive pressure within the Chinese infosphere was greater than it would be. China was sort of forced to be part of the world in a way that it would be less so if Google withdrew. So what's the argument that Google should never have dirtied its hands whatsoever with the Chinese government?
Well, I think the main argument here is that the Chinese government is not exactly a reliable business partner, right? So when Google struck that deal in 2005, I don't think that the Chinese thought of that deal as something static that would remain written and would never change. And as we have seen, over the last few years, there has been more and more pressure on Google to self-censor even more. So the Chinese government has consistently asked them, for example, YouTube became unavailable, right? They asked Google to shut down this auto-suggest function, right? Where you could now go to Google, for example, here and type something in, and it will then suggest the rest of your query, right? The Chinese asked to shut it down in China, right? So my understanding, and again, Rebecca here is a much better expert on the internal dynamics, but the pressure on Google has been growing and growing, and I think at some point they would have have no choice but to do even more evil things, whether it is giving up data about activists, whether it's more and more self-censorship. So from that perspective, I think it was a very silly thing to do in the first place, because they should have known who they were dealing with.
So in principle, Google should never have tried to be present in China at all.
No, I think they should have been trying to be present there, but they should have been cognizant of what would be the risks and the costs, and that those risks and costs would be growing as the political and social role of the internet in China is growing as well.
And Tim, do you want to address that now?
I kind of also disagree with you in the sense.
Okay,
in that, when the Soviet Union was in charge, no one had the New York Times saying, well, you should publish a censored version of the New York Times in Moscow, and they'll have a little more information, now the obituaries and the marriages, but a lot of media organizations stayed out of censorial regimes on principle.
But there was what would have been there's no sort of counterpart example for that. I mean, again, here as we at least three of us have lived in China and tried to deal with the internet there. If Google.cn is saying we will obey the laws of China as we obey the laws of any place we are, and my experience with university students in China is they were grateful to have more information from Google.cn than if it weren't there. So, and what do you say to them?
I think it's the same. I guess it's a matter of degree, but in China, the media is a regulated industry.
Sure.
And every internet companies are often not self-aware that they're actually media companies too. Yeah. And I think as an ethical matter, not only for their presence in China, but also whether it corrupts the whole organization. In other words, they might end up, they get used to censorship, and then they lose their will inside the United States also.
Okay. Were you ever working in China as representing Columbia University?
Vaguely, yeah.
Universities are as controlled in China as the media organizations are. Should Columbia have had you in China?
I see the point. I see the point, and if I had felt that I was being censored what I could say in China, and absolutely,
but of course you
left.
were.
But can I just jump into this? But again, it would be fine if Google was an NGO which was concerned with freedom of expression. Again, I'm only debating the business proposition of entering China in the first place. If it was Google.org or any other nonprofit effort within Google, fine. I mean, they may be losing money. There are plenty of organizations and NGOs which are working on circumvention issues in China. It's just that as a business decision, it seemed very...
Well, I'll give you here a different axis of disagreement, then I'll let you make what you say about hacking. As a business proposition, I think Google will suffer badly if it's not present in the Chinese market, because the next evolution, especially in mobile devices, will happen without Google's presence, which will be bad for it. But tell us what is significant in the whole hacking aspect of this, as you've written about a number of times.
Well, actually, I didn't find the hacking aspects as fascinating as it has been presented in the media. I mean, the truth is that most companies operating in China do experience cyber attacks of some kind. They do experience theft of intellectual property. And I think the most interesting thing about Google in China is that the cyber attacks are likely to continue even if Google decides to shut down their office and leave it altogether, simply because it does contain a lot of valuable information about Chinese human rights activities. People will still continue having their email inboxes hosted by Google, because if Google can be hacked, it means any other service can be hacked probably even more easily. Right, so my difficulty was in understanding how exactly the cyber attacks, which Google decided to publicize, how they actually related to its decision to stop censoring the results and adopt a different stance, because it didn't seem like it's going to protect them anymore.
No, they weren't logically related. It was just sort of a sign of exasperation that they'd had too much.
Sure, but on the other hand, now I see that the cyber attacks actually are making it possible to present it almost as a national security issue. Because I doubt that most media in the United States would make such a fuss out of Google's decision were it not framed as an attack by Chinese hackers on U.S. companies stealing data and no one is secure. And it became a completely different issue, which of course played in Google's hands. But I don't think we should make something extraordinary out of that. Cyber attacks happen, which is very unfortunate, and they will continue happening whether Google is in China or is not in China. As long as it does host this data, I mean, it's still a target.
Thank you. One other question about that, which before I give Tim a further chance. I have an article actually coming out shortly in the Atlantic on this whole cyber attack issue. Most people I interviewed said that China was a big source of attacks, but not the biggest. They said actually Russia was in most cases the biggest. Does that accord with your view?
Well, I mean, if you look at the traffic statistics, actually most, again, you have to distinguish between different kinds of attacks.
Yes.
There are so-called attacks which are network intrusions. So people are breaking into a network to steal data, right? This is one kind of attack. Then you also have denial of service attacks, where people are basically trying to slow down, a server or website to make it inaccessible, yes, right, by persistently sending traffic to it. If you look at that second kind of attacks, denial of service ones, they are actually mostly coming from Eastern Europe and Brazil. And Russia ranks particularly high. We know very little about network intrusion because companies do not have any incentive to disclose that they're being attacked, because normally it drives down their stock value. So Google was actually very forthcoming here in disclosing it, but we hear very little about whether Microsoft's data is being stolen or IBM's data is being stolen. But again, it is a business, and you can go and rent denial of service attacks on eBay sometimes, pay a few $100s, and then choose a target that you would like to be attacked. This is also actually creating a very big problem and a threat to the freedom of expression, because many of NGOs and many activists around the globe now are subject to these attacks, which makes their sites unavailable for a few days a month, or a few days a week, and exerts tremendous psychological pressure on them. We actually are beginning to see that as a new form of censorship. You do an attack the websites of organizations you do not like, and that drives them crazy. They eventually give up sooner or later.
All right, thank you. Tim, there are three potential issues on the table for you. I invite you to address one or all. First, in some of our previous discussions, there's a question of whether being involved in China at all is now so abhorrent that Western media or educational institutions should not do so. I am on record both in general and now in thinking it's worth being engaged. That's better in the long run. If you might make the opposite case, if you will. You've been writing a lot about trade, the trade implications of this kind of dispute. Anything on that front would be interesting. And a question I'm going to ask to all of you later. There is an argument that while Google will be hurt if it has to leave China, China in a different way will be hurt badly too, and that the ceiling on China's evolution is sort of its intellectual capital, being able to have great universities, free thinking. If it can't do that, it's going to be just a big factory forever, as opposed to a modern economy. Any of those you're welcome to address.
Right. I'm interested in this in the ethical question, because I think it's just hard and interesting. And I would not say I'm an absolutist in terms of this. I don't think anyone is. I mean, like you pointed out, I go to China and it's a good time, and
it's a good time in a certain way.
The young roach, I like to eat. I mean,
you don't like to breathe.
Yeah, but I do think there is some point where you can pass. Even when you link in an academic institution, to return to that, obviously you're going to gain a lot by academics spending time in China and so forth. But an academic institution could become corrupted if it just sort of becomes so invested in China that it begins to see its mandate as similar to the Chinese government state party's mandate as to what ideas should be.
Sure. And
it can definitely happen. I mean, if you're too heavily invested, if Colombia starts to own too much real estate and have too many investments, and then all of a sudden it does corrupt the academic mission. And so I really do think it's a matter of degree. And what I think is the problem is that there's very little thinking about this among tech companies. I'm going to point the finger at Microsoft for a good example. I think very limited self-awareness of the fact that they are actually a media company. They're software people. They're geeks, and but they are also in their search engine and in their web what they provide in terms of social networking and blogs and so forth. They are also a media company, and so they have ethical duties that they are not only not. The problem is not so much that they're just not even aware of them. It seems like sometimes, and that's what I'm talking about, and that's why I think. Google, I agree with you, it's a mixed story, but it's important to understand there is an underlying ethical issue here. At some point, you get corrupted.
And a specific question, when they decided to set up Google.cn 4 or 5 years ago, was that decision in itself on the wrong side of the line by your likes?
I think it was worth a shot.
Worth trying.
I think it was worth a shot. I think it was worth a shot, and I agree with what you said. And I'm glad that they've been aware the whole time there's been an internal dispute at Google the entire time, which I think is the right thing to do as to whether this is hurting, and I think that's the right approach. And I think other tech companies do not have that approach. And
just briefly on this point, before coming back to other things, do you agree, Rebecca, should Google.cn have been created or not?
Well, I think as Tim said, it's a very tough issue on which there was tremendous disagreement inside Google, and always was. And I think it may have been worth a shot. However, one of the things that I was really concerned about when they went forward was the extent to which, even though one could make the argument that Google.cn provided more information than Baidu, it was censored a little bit less, it was more transparent about the fact that it was censoring and so on, it did serve to legitimize the practice by multinational companies of acquiescing to domestic censorship practices and demands by governments. And that's what really concerned me, was that Google goes into China with Google.cn, and then they go to country X, Y, or Z that also happens to have a fast-growing, lucrative market. And the government says, well, you did this in China, you must do this in our country too. And then it just gets harder and harder, because they made this compromise in China, to resist pressures to compromise elsewhere. And that was my primary concern. Whether or not they felt that was happening may have played into their reconsideration of Google.cn. I do not know. On a related point, actually, somebody from Twitter named Dave Lyons, who is a technology researcher in Beijing, pointed out just now that Google.com has been accessible in China pretty much the whole time. It's rarely blocked.
Off and on.
It's a little harder, and a lot of the results end up timing out because you click on them and they're censored and your internet connection goes down. But that it has been accessible, and he's just pointing out that people
to interrupt there, even more, on Google.cn, there's always been a link to Google.com at the top of that page.
Saying you can go to Google.com.
Which the Chinese authorities actually asked Google to remove, which was another one of those demands.
Sort of a dispute. So, I mean, but I think what Tim says about self-awareness is really important. And I think it's a real question whether Google did the right thing. But I think you can argue that they did, and I know a lot of Chinese people, even those who are quite critical of censorship, like Isaac Mao, who say, Google has become really essential to kind of the Chinese liberal community. They all use its products, and that this compromise was worth it because they're all using Gmail and Google Docs and they're not blocked and so on. And that's a pretty powerful argument. On the other hand, this concern about the global context of the precedent it sets for the relationship between companies like Google and governments generally is a serious concern. But at least Google, as Tim said, was self-aware.
Right.
They were thinking and debating about these things. And I want to point out, not to make too much of a plug, but Google is a founding member, alongside Yahoo and Microsoft, of a multi-stakeholder initiative called the Global Network Initiative, which is set up precisely with this idea in mind to help technology companies, to help internet companies become self-aware, and to help them think through these issues before they get slapped with just intractable problems for which there are no good answers, and end up like Yahoo, having handed over dissident information
Which is
and having gone way too far down the pike without having thought through where they were going, and so. The point is there does need to be a great deal more self-awareness of companies. They need to think about the human rights implications of their businesses and the free expression implications of their businesses well in advance of specific products and specific services. And there are structures now being set up to help companies think through this. And one thing that's very disappointing is the fact that aside from Google and Yahoo and Microsoft, no other technology company so far have had the guts to sign on to this thing, and it's really time to get real.
Right.
And so is globalnetworkinitiative.org. Just a little plug, but I think it's relevant here.
And so, for clarity, you would have voted yes 5 years ago to try it with conditions.
Actually, at the time, I thought it was a bad idea.
But you would have voted no 5 years ago.
At the time, I thought it was a bad idea.
I'm just looking for a binary choice here for a second.
And I'm really torn whether it was.
Say yes or no.
5 years on, I'm torn whether it was a good idea or not.
Okay, Evgeny,
sorry,
you're saying that you would not have tried it at all.
I wouldn't have tried it, and I think, should I give some reasoning or do a binary choice?
Let's see. I actually would like to move on to this other point about sort of the evolution of China for now. And Tim, you're talking either about trade legislation or the role being part of or separate from the world's information evolution, what that means for China.
No, it's a very important point. It's very little, I think, understood that censorship, filtering, blocking, can also be understood as a trade barrier. That is to say, if you cannot reach Google.com in China, the American site, that is what the trade system calls a barrier in trade to services. And so this has all this censorship stuff has another face, which is through the World Trade System. China is a very unusual country in the world trading system. Not since its formation in 1945 has there been such a censorial country. The sort of bloc, the Soviet bloc, was excluded from the trade system because they didn't really work with its liberal principles. And the admission to China to the World Trade System, which people thought was generally a good idea, had a lot of challenges, and this is one of them. It is unclear, really, whether China can, I think, maintain its full scale, full breadth of censorship practices, particularly when they have a commercial impact, particularly when they benefit their own companies at the expense of foreign companies, and maintain its standing in the WTO. This isn't something that the USTR has yet been taking on in an aggressive manner, but it is something when we talk, we were asking Alex what part of government should be doing this. The classic role of the USTR is to protect American exporters. Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, eBay are all American exporters. They're exporting information products, which is slightly different than tomatoes or cars, but they are nonetheless exporting probably America's, right now, one of America's most important export products, and they are in that facility, in that role, being blocked, and their job is being made impossible. So I think it's very important that this is seen, and I don't mean to minimize it by saying it's a human rights issue, but also as a fundamental issue of China's role in the world trading system.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Evgeny a question. In just a moment, we're going to have questions from the crowd, anybody who can send them in by Twitter or other means of these modern communication devices. Do you have a view, Evgeny, on this question I was asking about whether China faces a limit to its full maturation as a power, as an economic organism, if it separates itself from the world infosphere? And what do you think U.S. policy should be in dealing with China and dealing with Internet censorship in general?
Sure. I'll just briefly comment on what Tim just said about trade, because I think it is a very important issue. But what we are also beginning to see is that very often trade rules, and particularly rules about software piracy and sort of copyright, are actually being used by the governments to crack down on activists and NGOs they do not like. Because it's very easy to pick any random activist and NGO and discover that they run an illegal version of Microsoft Windows, or that they have an illegal Hollywood movie stored on their hard drive. We actually saw that in Russia a few years ago, where the government started going around offices of the NGOs to check if they are actually running the proper version of Windows, right? So again, not that they shouldn't be doing it. They have all now switched to open source alternatives, but it's also increasingly being used by the governments to justify their own repression. With regards to the actual question, I actually have a slightly different take on this, and I think it's probably different from Rebecca's view. I actually think that the nature of Internet control is evolving very rapidly, and it is now much more diverse, so to say, than just censorship alone. There are ways in which you can still control the conversation and what gets said and who sets the agenda without necessarily having to censor the internet. Yeah. You look at, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on modern China, so I sort of try to put it in the global context. You look at Russia now. And Russia censors the internet probably less than Australia or the United Kingdom. Right? At the actual level of what gets blocked, it's very little. Right? Even look at Egypt. Right? Egypt blocks very little, right, compared to Tunisia or other governments. That said, there are still a lot of very sinister activities that the government is engaged in. It could be intimidation of bloggers. It could be threats, as does happen in Egypt very often. It could be all sorts of propaganda activities, with the government paying commentators to take a discussion that is happening online in a different direction, which is favorable to the government, right? It's surveillance, which again is happening more and more, and we are seeing that more and more data is actually being self-disclosed by activists on social networks, right? People who think that they're doing a lot of good by joining some anti-government Facebook group are actually putting themselves into danger by actually revealing who they are and who they are connected with, right? So my feeling is that even though we may be seeing less censorship over the next few years or next few decades, it would not necessarily mean that the governments would have lost the ability to control what is said and who says it, right? Yeah. So, and I think they will be able to survive even without strong censorship, as Russia demonstrates.
Great, thank you. A last question for you, Rebecca, before we open to the floor. On this point of whether China needs Google, needs to be connected to the world cultural first-level information exchange to really develop, to be more than just a manufacturing infrastructure power.
Well, I think it's complicated, and it depends on how you define China. Is it the Chinese people, or is it Chinese Communist Party? And are you looking short-term, or are you looking long-term? If you're looking short-term, you can say, up yours, Google, go away. This is great for domestic companies. It's great for Baidu. It's great for our local industry. And you can say it's our sovereign right to do whatever we want to do to our internet, and you do things to your internet, and you're hypocrites, and go away and leave us alone, et cetera. But I mean, in the long term, I tend to agree with the many millions of people in China who feel that their ability to innovate and their ability to learn and their ability to prosper and to really do the kind of business they want to do is suffering because of censorship and information controls. And I tend to find those people's arguments more convincing. Now, whether that is compatible with the Chinese Communist Party's survival, of course, is another question. And I think this is part of the problem, is that the reason why the Communist Party of China has survived so much longer than most people in the West ever imagined is that up until now, it has been able to provide a very satisfactory trade-off. It's been able to deliver growth. It's been able to bring China to this point of, all of us calling it a global economic force, and et cetera, et cetera. But will they continue to deliver that, or have we hit the point where their need to stay in power gets in the way of China's need and the Chinese people's right to have the most successful economy possible? And so, I mean, I would argue that, the Chinese people and China will benefit tremendously from being open. Will the Chinese Communist Party benefit? And, again, up until now, the two have converged enough. But they may be starting to diverge more and more. Maybe not. I mean, 20 years ago we were all saying that it wasn't going to work, and it has for the past 20 years. So maybe they'll readjust again. I mean, China's history of the last several decades has all been about the Chinese Communist Party hits a crisis point where if it doesn't completely rethink itself, it loses power, and then lo and behold, contrary to anybody's expectations, they do manage to rethink themselves. That happened in 79, and it happened soon after 89. And so is this another moment where they either need to rethink themselves again or lose it? I don't know.
My assignment for you, Rebecca, is to collect some questions from Twitter.
Sure.
And before I call here, I have two procedural things. One is to say, based on my own recent living in China, I basically agree with what Rebecca just said, that China's successes have been in infrastructure and manufacturing and factories, and to get to the next level, there really is this issue about whether universities, media, free exchange of ideas can be compatible with the communist leadership, and we'll see. Here's a housekeeping note, which is, it's a sign of, it will be an odd sign that I'm saying this, but it only just now occurred to me. I need, for the first 10 years of the New America Foundation's existence, I was the chairman of its board. My successor as the chairman of its board is Eric Schmidt, who is the CEO of Google. I mention this for full disclosure reasons. Neither Eric nor anybody at Google has any idea we're putting on this session. They had no role whatsoever, but it only occurred to me now as a sign of sort of the remoteness of their involvement on substance issues, but for the record, that should be known. Yes, please identify yourself and ask a question. Yes, we have a microphone coming to you.
Hi, I'm Kristina Larson. I'm an editor at Foreign Policy and also a fellow here at the New America Foundation. I had a question for Rebecca, and others, please feel free to chime in. There's some great Wall Street Journal reporting about a disagreement between Sergey Brin and Eric Schmidt of Google about their involvement in China over the past 4 or 5 years. And I wondered if you could speak to, within China, within the Chinese government entities that are responsible for deciding policies relevant to censorship, to web hosting, to how to deal with foreign companies, if there's been any kind of a parallel debate, within China, what are sort of the ambiguities that, 2 steps forward, 1 step back?
Good question. If we knew half as much about the inner debates in China as we know about the inner debates in Google, that would be really fabulous. I heard from a Chinese friend the other day who said that he'd heard from friends of his in the government who are really flummoxed about how to deal with this. And so I think Google, I mean, there's been some analysis elsewhere as well that Google's public stand really was unanticipated and has really thrown the leadership for a loop in how to deal with it. There certainly are internal debates, and China, as the China people in the room know, is a patchwork of ministries and competing interests, and there's a lot of bargaining about interests that go on in terms of what policies get made, and sometimes one ministry will implement a policy and then other ministries will say, hey, wait a minute, that's not in our interest, and kind of slap it down. And those kinds of things happen a lot. I mean, there is one sort of overarching kind of decision-making process, which is when, if the very top, at the top Politburo level, perceives something to be damaging to the CCP's central legitimacy, that's kind of the ultimate sort of decision factor involved. But for instance, with Green Dam, that was a Green Dam censorship software is a great example of kind of differing views in different parts of the Chinese government, where you had a situation, Green Dam, there basically back in May, and it became public in June, that the Ministry of Information, Industry and Technology, they're always changing their name, but MIIT had issued this edict that all computers sold in China as of July 1st had to come pre-installed with this censorship software called Green Dam that was ostensibly to protect China's children from porn, but as soon as anybody tested it, they found it was blocking all kinds of political content and also monitoring people, and also it was just kind of faulty, and it involved intellectual property violations from American companies, and it was just, in so many levels, not good. And that also the company that wrote the software was, buddies, the CEO was buddies with somebody in the ministry, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, this edict came out, and Western industry reacted badly. Many people in China reacted badly, and other parts of the government who hadn't been paying attention to this particular thing that MIT was up to kind of went, hey, wait a minute, that was pretty dumb. I mean, they didn't say that publicly, but internally there were conversations to that effect. You know, what is MIT doing? And then you kind of saw this power struggle going on and arguments internally about how to deal with the fact that Green Dam was just so problematic on so many levels that whether or not to insist upon its implementation and continue enforcing it or back down, and the government ended up deciding to back down after a lot of internal debates and debates throughout the Chinese public domestically. And usually if there's a big debate happening that different parts of the government feel really strongly about, you'll tend to see it cropping up, like different media will sort of reflect different points of view, and then you'll begin to realize that it's not under unified control. So there definitely are debates, but usually, when it comes down to what the Politburo deems as national security, then the boom will come down. So, for instance, I don't know how financially damaging it was for Xinjiang province to have its internet cut off for many months. I know it's hit businesses in that region very hard, but that was irrelevant because the government deemed it to be a national security matter. So there will be times when sort of the national security concerns will trump all other arguments.
Tim, do you have any? And whenever you want to, I'll call back here. Whenever you have an illustration of conflicting objectives, as Rebecca was saying, remember the run-up to the Olympics, where the foreign ministry, as part of an act of openness to the world, says there's going to be authorized protest areas during the Olympics, and then the security ministry arrested people who applied to protest. It was a wonderful chaos. Yes, back there. Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Russ Hanser. I'm a FCC alum and a telecom regulatory lawyer. Though my biggest achievement is that I sat in front of Tim Wu in Larry Lessig's internet law class 13 years ago. So back then in the late 90s, there was all kinds of talk about how the internet was impervious to the nation state. There's, I think, John Gilmore's famous quote about how the internet perceives censorship as damage and routes around it. There were law review articles about how the internet transcended borders. It seems to me that meme has died a long and deserved death as people realize that servers and wires actually have to live somewhere, and it's usually within a nation state. Tim Wu and Jack Goldsmith wrote a great book on this topic that everyone interested in this issue should read. So my question is, I mean, this idea that nation states actually do have much control over the internet is so obvious to everyone now that it's been an implicit sort of premise of this whole discussion, and it's obviously made quite evident by this Google-China dispute. And I guess my question is, what are the implications for how we conceive of the internet more broadly? The internet is obviously a different kind of beast than we thought it was 10 years ago or 13 years ago, and we hoped that it would have a huge generative global impact, not just in the business world, but also in the social and political worlds. And that changes a little bit. And it may be that China is the most repressive regime in this regard, but A, it's a large country, and B, it's hardly the only illiberal regime and the only autocratic regime. So how do we think about what the internet is and can be under this new set of realities?
Yeah, well, thanks, and I'll take the question. I think, and this is what I said in my book, so it's not really news to you, but I think that we are seeing the world moving away from a global internet and towards ever more a series of national networks. We do see, there are, when you're in China, you're basically on the Chinese internet. When you're in other parts of the world, you're on an internet. India, you're sort of on an Indian internet. There's sort of similar companies. You maybe will sort of some version of a search engine, some version of eBay, and so forth. In the sense that you have, you can see McDonald's all over the world, but they're increasingly does it feel much less as if you're on a global network. And you could ask yourself, when's the last time I actually went to a foreign website? I think in the beginning days of the internet, it was all sort of, there's no American website. It's just websites, right? They're sort of floating in cyberspace. And I think today most people kind of stay home, frankly, and maybe within their country or within their language region. So I think the way to think about it is that is generally happening. The second thing to say is that it is a matter of choice how global or unglobal the internet is and how interconnected it is. And that's sort of the topic of this entire panel, is that countries do have power to choose, and they do it generally through the law. The two laws I'm going to point to are, well, there's norms, but also in the law it's the world trading system, as I've suggested, and then also these debates about net neutrality. People think net neutrality and censorship may be unrelated, but the net neutrality debates are basically debates over what the internet should be and how open and interconnected it should be. So the whole debates about global internet freedom are also debates about this topic that FCC people call net neutrality.
Thanks. Evgeny, yes.
I agree with Tim on the rise of the national internet, right? But again, I think we also have to distinguish between the rise of the national internet, which is definitely happening, and the possible decline of the nation state, which may be happening as well, right? And again, the key question here is who actually holds power and how the internet redistributes that power within a society, right? If you look at, again, a country like China or a country like Russia, well, do we see more, for example, nationalism driven by the internet? I would say yes. We do see more and more nationalistic groups which are using the internet to spread their message, but also to amplify what they're already saying and recruit more members, right? Again, both China and Russia are very complex societies from an ethnic perspective. There are so many ethnic groups, then it's not at all given that the dominant ethnic group will remain in power forever, right? You look at Russia, you do see a lot of Tatars, for example, now being extremely active online. Probably the internet now is the only place where Tatar nationalism actually exists and is growing, right? And again, I'm not exactly sure how the internet will reshape the power relations within a state. It may as well mean that the dominant ethnic group will become more powerful. It may also mean that other ethnic groups will become even more powerful, right? And then again, we get into all sorts of media questions where it is definitely true that now there are more sources through which information can flow, right? It may mean good thing for the activists. It may also mean good thing for the government because they will have more channels which will be more trustworthy to spread their propaganda around, right? So I don't have a definitive answer here, but I think it's definitely not the bright future which Nicholas Negroponte predicted in 1995, where when he said, you know, there will be less space for nationalism on the internet than there is currently for smallpox, right? I don't think that future is anywhere close yet.
Right. So do you have something to add or not?
Yeah, just a quick point. I mean, the internet really has created this whole new layer of human existence into which we have a whole new set of questions about sovereignty, about consent of the governed, about what governance is. About what association is and the extent to which it's connected to physical borders and the extent to which it's not, and really interesting questions about the extent to which our government's going to have to sort of share sovereignty in a way or rearrange the social contract with citizens to involve the fact that there are these cross-border allegiances, that there is this layer called the internet which provides all these transnational factors, and will the successful governments find ways to kind of cede power to this, and unsuccessful governments try and block it, or share power, share kind of legitimacy and social contract with that, if one wants to get into sort of political theory wonkishness.
Right. So let's take a question here from this young lady in the black hair, and then Rebecca, will you prepare a gist question that's coming in online?
Sure.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm Julie Sheets with Brooks Bauer Asia. So my question is more about what you're talking about, self-censorship, and the idea of the universities. Because I lived in China for a few years, and certainly it's annoying to try and find a proxy server that can get you anywhere near to the speed of what you can get in the US to access some of those sites. But all of my students and all the people that I worked with had also found these sites. So the problem that I encountered, and I don't know if you have the same opinion about this, is the mental framework to be able to analyze the information that they're seeing. So it's one thing for me to be able to read a BBC article about what's happening in Xinjiang, and I have my own cultural background, and that allows me to sort of intake that information. But as a Chinese student growing up in a system where they've systematically never been asked to analyze anything and never been consistently exposed to these things, I mean, their reaction is completely different. So I think a lot of the articles that I've seen about this have said, well, it's such a tragedy they can't access the information. But, I mean, I don't know if this is your experience, but I think the bigger tragedy is they mentally can't access the information. They just don't have the framework, I think, or the cultural boundaries are there, that they're self-censoring in their own analysis.
I'll take the prerogative of answering that first myself, and seeing if anybody wants to agree or disagree. I agree with you. As you point out, and as anybody who's been in China recognizes, there are ways to get past the firewall relatively easy, whether it's a proxy server or a VPN, which is fairly cheap or whatever. And the truth is, most people don't bother to do that. And your related point about education, many people in the U.S. point to the educational system as China's greatest strength. I view it as China's greatest weakness for the reasons you point out, that it produces a lot of sort of people trained in a certain way. Agree or disagree?
I just have one point, which is language is really the greatest. You know, a language just does most of the work, frankly. I mean, even if you have access to whatever, if you don't read English comfortably, then you're not going to read it. And how many Americans read Chinese comfortably and just
Yeah. I mean, the internet does not only does it not eliminate cultural and linguistic differences, but it also doesn't change human nature. And I think one of the problems with cyber utopianism was this kind of idea that it was just going to sort of eliminate a lot of our less admirable qualities as human beings, and one of them is just the lack of interest in alternative points of view. Mm-hmm. And several of the Twitter questions actually are raising the fact that people they know in China or their Chinese students and so on are not interested in getting around the firewall because they think it's probably anti-China information anyway, or that many people in China feel that, well, it's better for China's stability to censor the internet because if you really did open it up right away, it would everything would fall apart and it would be chaos, and nobody wants that, et cetera, et cetera. So it's understandable and desirable to have this framework. But I mean, just to add, I mean, the human sort of tendency to kind of censor one's own information environment is certainly not unique to Chinese people or to people in authoritarian countries. I mean, full disclosure, I'm a flaming liberal, and so therefore, people who only believe Fox News, and refuse to acknowledge other points of view, I find, a lot of parallels between them and some of the Chinese nationalists I know, who hang out at the anti-CNN community. So, it's sort of this desire to believe a certain thing, to be able to wave the flag and go rah-rah and play on a particular team, and to shut out from their mind information that might make them, force them to think critically about their own country and make them feel bad about being from a particular country. Right. And that's a universal human tendency, which censorship then reinforces. Okay, we're going to move into lightning round mode now to try to get through more questions. I'm going to point out briefly, my wife Deb, who is here while we were in China, did the report for the Pew Internet Project run by Lee Rainey there, showing that most Chinese netizens welcomed the control, because for the reason you said about the chaos. Evgeny, did you have a brief point to make there?
Yes. I actually think that, as we have discovered over the last few decades, one of the main survival strategies for authoritarian states, including China's, has been cultivating this sense of suspicion towards anything which is modern in the West or by the Western media. Right? So I do not really think that by simply opening up the Chinese firewall, if it does happen suddenly tomorrow, suddenly all the Chinese will start, or Russians for that matter, will start recognizing the value of CNN or BBC or any other reports. And the project which, Rebecca pointed out, to anti-CNN.com, I think is a perfect example of how pretty well-educated netizens can actually come together and come up with a very intriguing new media project which does nothing but media criticism and identifying errors in Western media, which do sound very persuasive, I must say.
Yeah, and that project, just to add a footnote, that project is run by a number of people who have spent a lot of time outside of China and are very well aware of other points of view and have chosen to focus on trashing the anti-China Western conspiracies.
So here's our goal now. Quick questions, quick answers. Is there a quick question that's coming from Twitter? a one-sentence or two-sentence version of a question.
Yeah,
or, okay,
I had just,
let's have this gentleman here, in the white shirt and the necktie, while Rebecca's doing.
Yes, Nicholas Hamasevich from the Heritage Foundation. Just a question to kind of pick up on this topic here on the Chinese citizens not choosing other information, don't want to choose other information. So how does that alter the U.S.'s strategy of just putting new information into other countries, saying, here's all the information, but if they don't want to choose it, then what? How does the U.S. government, right? How does the U.S. government kind of change its strategy, or does it need to change the strategy, or change the information, or change the message on?
All I can do is make it. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, the U.S. Some people will be interested. The point is that if the information isn't available at all, there's no chance for people to get interested in it. I think it's that simple.
Yeah.
Right, and it reinforces existing thought patterns. I think that's...
Yeah.
So, Rebecca,
but there is also a matter of tone and approach. I know a lot of people in China who don't like Voice of America or Radio Free Asia because they think it's very preachy. And they think it's like, we Americans are here to provide you poor Chinese with free information you don't have. And they find that offensive and patronizing. And so it's also a matter of tone.
Right.
I think there are ways to have more of a conversation about common problems rather than to say, here's our cool stuff that you don't have, which and that you'd be able to engage people.
So give us a Twitter question for one of your colleagues.
A Twitter question from our friend Kaiser Guo brings it back to the Google issue. He wants to know, what are the cards that Google actually holds now? In terms of their negotiations with the Chinese government? Is it goodwill from an important constituency, a smoking gun on the hacking, or what? He wants to know.
Kaiser is a friend of many people here, known for his column "Ich bin ein Beijinger." Tim, would you like to answer this?
I don't know if they have a lot. I mean, I don't know if they have a lot of cards. Google. I hate to say it. They have the card of exactly what he said. They can say we're pulling out of China and China is acting outrageously. China says, "I'm sorry, follow our laws or get the hell out." So.
Well, I think we'll know the main card tomorrow when Clinton makes her speech, and I think that will make a lot of things very clear. But beyond that, I think continuing to frame it as a national security issue for Google would really be most helpful in terms of generating goodwill, at least with American policymakers.
Yeah, that's actually a better answer. I forgot about the U.S. government. I wanted to answer. I had another answer for your question. America's secret weapon for this, is the entertainment industry.
Yes.
Not the media industry. It's a much more effective diplomatic tool. Hollywood.
Yep. I agree. Yes.
Avatar.
So first this gentleman back here, then the woman. Yes.
Hi, I'm Scott Mackey, Internews Network. But just brief question, you were talking earlier about in Russia there's not a lot of censorship. And in this new media world, they're using very old school forms of intimidation, for example. Or Alec Ross was talking earlier about trying to use new media or technology in the DRC to combat gender-based violence. But in these areas, you see a lot of times there's not the institutions or there's not the infrastructure to actually support this new information we're putting into the societies. And so kind of going off your question a little bit ago, where on the spectrum of like democracy promotion, for example, does it fall old school forms of just trying to build institutions or work with non-governmental organizations within countries, and where is the, from a new media perspective, just getting the information out there, and how do you find the balance within that?
Would like to answer.
Yeah, just one further point. It also picks up on the other question as well. I think in a lot of cases, particularly in China, but I think in many countries where a certain segment of society isn't able to get heard, that actually the best thing to do might not be to worry about, let's bring stuff into you. I mean, obviously helping to combat censorship, but is to empower the voices that are being squashed from within, and to help create communities and platforms on which, the Chinese liberal blogosphere, which, if it were able to exist freely, would be very large. Or certainly would match the conservative flag-waving, cohorts. They have a real difficulty finding sort of a home for their conversation, which is why a lot of them have all migrated to Twitter, because that's where they can have an uncensored conversation. But helping to just facilitate platforms and let some of these people spread the information around, because they also they're these people who are sort of nodes within China. and who are respected by their peers because their peers within China trust them that if they link to some information from outside, then it's worth paying attention to. Whereas if VOA sends it to them, they're not interested. And so to empower these people who are kind of thought leaders within China, who are influential amongst their peers in China, to have a voice and be heard and to have a platform for conversation, I think is almost more important than let's figure out how to get the information into them. It's more just about who are the people who can really be nodes who already exist in China and give them a real platform.
Yes, brief addition.
Yes,
yep.
I'll be brief. I think it's easy to answer a question if you imagine the two very radical alternatives, right, which do sort of policymakers, which they do face them. I think the first one is to act as if the internet doesn't exist, right, and to continue doing what we have been doing since the Cold War and during the Cold War, right? I think the other option is to go really, really radical and to think that it's all just about the internet and cyberspace and say, let's just scrap all public diplomacy efforts, let's shut down, Voice of America, and let's sort of empower Chinese bloggers who engage in some great deliberation and eventually settle on democracy as the ideal way of governance, right? And it sort of reminds me of, the infinite monkey theorem, which says that if you give monkeys enough typewriters, they'll essentially produce Shakespeare, right? This is not to sort of sound sort of too arrogant here, but I think there is a role which the American media and the government can actually play in this, and they shouldn't be withdrawing from it. What I think needs to be done is to actually start tracking these non-traditional violations of freedom of expression, like, for example, cyber attacks. So when we talk about freedom of expression, we do track when, a journalist is harassed or is arrested. We never track whether the website or blog is actually, under a cyber attack or spends 1/3 of its time sort of unavailable because someone is attacking it, right? Those things rarely register on the radar of Reporters Without Borders or others. And we need to get much more sophisticated and develop better metrics for actually measuring those violations and then acting upon them.
Right. Thank you. Yes, this woman here. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Donna McCoy. I actually am not with any company. I currently have a Master's of International Business, and my question is, Mr. Wu was talking about censorship, filtering, blocking can be looked at as a trade barrier, as trade of services. According to my research, I did a paper, investment in human capital towards economic prosperity, investment in human capital towards economic prosperity in emerging economies of China and India, and I graduated in 2007. I looked at different policies. One of the policies that I looked at was the General Agreement of Trade Services, right. And that is actually tied into the education sector and dealing with human capital in forms of how we have different ways that we negotiate trade and services with certain countries. Right. In doing so, we allow students to come to our country to learn and to go to different educational systems in exchange for us, the United States, having access to different.
And can you bring this to its point?
Okay. The point is that I want to know what type of impact is it going to have in terms of mobilizing human capital, and in regards to how the barrier can help with how we can eliminate the barrier and hopefully come up with some type of policy. It's pretty technical what I'm trying to do, and I can't.
Let me actually clarify what I said. I'll be brief. I did a study of the Global Agreement on Trade and Services and concluded that it's in a paper called the World Trade Law of Internet Filtering, that blocking a site like Google or eBay can be considered a barrier to trade in services. That's what I'm suggesting. That treaty covers a lot of different stuff, and there's like educational things and a lot of other different services. But one of the services it covers are basically internet services. And it's a complicated legal analysis, but I refer you to this paper if you're interested.
And I think you all can discuss this after the session. Rebecca, is there a last question from the Twitter world?
Well, somebody, I haven't seen this elsewhere yet. this morning, but somebody, Lonnie Hodge in China, just said that Google CN's, they have a blog, and that they announced that it's business as usual. But
I've been following that overnight, and I think they are disputed. That they're still operating there, but they're still in negotiations.
Right. That was my understanding as well.
Tim,
closing.
Yes. We're in the closing round. Closing pensées of 1 minute or less from each of you.
Yeah, I kept thinking about the question that you and Rebecca were talking about in the last round of questions, which is, I think it's an open question of how far you can develop your information sector while continuing to be censorial. Mm-hmm. It's something, information and service sector. You can to some extent. I think France in the 18th century was a censorial country, but was pretty, I don't know if they really had an information economy, but they had services. This is the opening and really interesting question. We've seen, contrary to what a lot of people thought, that you can have a authoritarian regime that has a very successful manufacturing and infrastructure center. But this final question about whether you can have an information service economy and still ban any criticism of the government is an unanswered question.
And a very interesting one, I think. Yes, Evgeny, any closing pensée?
Sure. I mean, again, my earlier remark about the changing nature of internet control was partly in response to that question as well. I do think that it may be possible for China to continue growing and just settle on a slightly different model of internet control, right, which would not necessarily be driven by censorship. My other point is that, and my hope is that, this debacle in China now that Google faces, I hope it will actually help to shift its own sort of intellectual mode from this engineering-driven kind of computer science-driven consideration and introduce more historical and political sensibilities into it, which I think have been missing up until now. Where it was all about, here's an objective, we need to digitize everything in 10 years, and trust us, we are good, we'll do it, no questions asked. I think right now we'll be having more and more debates about how you can actually do it, but still do not forget about politics or ethics or history in the process.
Very interesting. Yes, Rebecca.
And just finally, I think one thing I hope people don't take away is an idea that thanks to the internet, it's inevitable and inexorable that authoritarianism is doomed everywhere. I think what we've learned from the China case is that authoritarianism can adapt to the internet age much better than anybody imagines. I think also one thing that's very interesting is if we look both at the future sort of legal architecture of the network, there are open questions about whether we're all going from authoritarianism to democracy or whether we're all going to meet in the middle. And there are also open questions about the future architecture of the Internet. And as we get into the next generation of the Internet and IPv6 and the Internet of Things, will people be a lot more, is anonymity going to be eliminated? There's all kinds of questions. And China is very actively involved in working and in investing in, IPv6, in the next generation of mobile internet devices. Wen Jiabao is going around talking about the Internet of Things. And China's actually putting a lot of cards on the idea that China is going to innovate and lead innovation in the next generation of internet architecture. And not only is this going to make Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE and so on more competitive in the most quickly developing markets like Africa and the Middle East, where everybody's on mobile anyway, but it's also going to help shape the future of the Internet in a direction that's much more compatible with the survival of authoritarian regimes. And so let's not all just go, declare victory and be happy. I think there's a lot of serious problems that need to be worked on if we want a free and open internet to actually be our future.
Great. Thank you. We've reached the end of our time. This has been an extraordinarily rich discussion, I think, and raised questions that we'll all be discussing for a long time. And I think our panelists can stay for a while to discuss unasked questions. But I think we've had a lot to consider, and so I'd like to thank Slate. I'd like to thank the New America Foundation. I'd like to thank Tim Wu, Evgeny Morozov, and Rebecca McKinnon, and Alec Ross. Thank you all for coming.
I can't stay. I've got to go.